Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Confabulating. We are honored to be joined tonight by Professor Sophie Page of UCL, who will be discussing with us tonight the subject of medieval magic. Professor Page joined UCL in 2002 as a permanent lecturer, studying beforehand at the Warburg Institute, UCL and Cambridge University. Her main research interests include European medieval magic and astrology, particularly with relation to orthodox religion, natural philosophy, medicine, and cosmology. And she's also interested in the interrelation between magic and imagery, diagrams, and animals in the Middle Ages. Some of her prominent publications include a volume in 2013 entitled Magic in the Cloister, Pious Motives, Illicit Interests, and Occult Approaches to the Medieval Universe, 2 volumes in 2011 entitled The Unorthodox Imagination in Late Medieval Britain and the Routledge History of Medieval Magic, and 2 volumes with the British Library, those being Astrology in Medieval Manuscripts and Magic in Medieval Manuscripts. Professor Page is currently working on a book on animals and demons in the Middle Ages, as well as an article on diagrams and magical texts. And she also curated the Ashmolean Museum exhibit, Spellbound, Magic, Rituals, and Witchcraft. Professor Page, thank you ever so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much for inviting me in that kind introduction.
Thank you, Professor. First of all, maybe if Professor Page could just give us an understanding what was the magic during medieval ages, just a little bit of context, so we can go from there.
So I define magic as a practical art that claims to offer the tools to manipulate the cosmos. And as a historian of medieval magic, I work on a very diverse range of sources, from very short charms and recipes. There's a recipe to speak to birds, for example, by mixing, putting the tongue of a kite, the bird of prey, in honey and eating it. And then very complex ritual texts. There's a text to summon angels called the Osnatorian, which takes over 3 years to perform. So magic, to me, ranges in what it's thought to be, from very simple things that circulated orally to quite complex things, probably mainly performed by monks in a monastery. And it is a practice we find in every social group in the Middle Ages. And so it can tell us all sorts of things about different interior lives and experiences and hopes and anxieties, which lead people to perform rituals. At the same time, it's marginal in medieval society, partly because it's transgressive, and many magic texts are condemned as illicit. And to go back to my definition for one moment, that it's tools to manipulate the cosmos. As a historian of magic, one of the things I'm most interested in is the different cosmological outlooks revealed in these texts. So they rely on mainstream religion and science, ideas about God, angels, demons, animals, and other natural objects, the planets. But they put these in kind of interesting, individual, subversive, very syncretic combinations, drawing on Jewish, Greek, Arabic, as well as Christian traditions. And so for me as sources, they're wonderful ways to really think about how medieval people understood their universe and the beings that inhabited it, and how they might harness for their own ends some of the forces within it.
Sorry. My was off. Could we say there was more than one type of magic during that period?
Yes. The straightforward and possibly boring answer would be that magic is this baggy, capacious term that it's easier to define if you're only addressing one kind of magic. So if you think of magic as a religious activity, as a basically as a transgressive ritual that is trying to do what other religious rituals are trying to do: contact God, have help from angels, command demons, then you would find lots of magic texts to support your view. Necromancy, rituals to summon demons, other texts to summon angels. But if you thought of magic as something that was rather like a scientific pursuit, it's trying to understand properties in the natural world and how to manipulate them, then there are also magic texts to prove your point of view as well. So this makes magic difficult to define for historians, because historians specialize, and so some historians prefer the religious kinds of magic texts and others the scientific kind. So anyway, just to answer your question, there are lots of different ways one could divide up magic in terms of oral, literate, more religious, more scientific, those that interested monks, those that interested farmers, those that were considered extremely transgressive and condemned in multiple different texts, and others which talked about magic, even described magic rituals, and were viewed as licit. So there's also a kind of a spectrum of orthodoxy that's quite an interesting way, I think, to approach magic.
And just to touch on that point as well, because when I read a little bit about that, I saw there is more than one type of people that perform magic as well. And they even mention sometimes that the clergy sometimes perform magic during a period of time. Is that true?
Yes. Magic was very attractive to members of the clergy for lots of different reasons. If we go back to my definition that it's a practical art that is claiming to offer the tools to manipulate the cosmos, what it did was it took a set of skills that clerics already possess. They are trained in ritual. You come out of clerical training in the Middle Ages, and you might have probably been trained as an exorcist. You have some training in commanding demons. You have training in the liturgy, and the liturgy is prayers, invocations of God. It's these kinds of rituals that are used to summon angels in magic texts. So you have the right expertise. And then if we look at some of the goals of magic texts, to have a vision of God, to have the companionship of angels, to command demons to do your bidding, these are like imaginative extensions of what a cleric did. So this is one way of looking at it that's quite idealized. One imagines, and I wrote a book about monks practicing magic. So one imagines the monk in his cloister, and he's been told he's living in a universe surrounded by millions of invisible spirits. There are angels, there are demons. But unlike Judaism, unlike Islam, with the jinns that are more vivid in let's say in daily life, in Christianity there was an anxiety about the cult of angels. There's anxiety about spirits. So you're told that your cosmos is filled with invisible spirits, but you're not given any details about them, because to name and give qualities to an angel might lead to the worship of the angel or an inappropriate relationship. We have saints for that purpose. So it's been argued, and I think correctly, that curiosity there's a certain cosmological curiosity among clerics whose life involves thinking about angels and demons and God. But there's another way of looking at it, and this comes from the study of necromancy, texts to summon demons. These texts are for the most part, to have women, to have power, to have the favor of princes, to have treasure, to have horses, flying horses, as a feature. So it's been argued that the clerics who were interested in this kind of magic actually thought they were missing out. So everything they want is what secular men had in society.
Yeah, exactly.
Using, because magic, another way I've said we can look at magic as a religious activity or as a scientific pursuit. It can also be viewed as a fantasy.
True. Exactly, yeah.
And some of these texts were probably collected for their value as fantasy, not to be practiced. And that's what necromancy presents, is a fantasy of what you don't have as a cleric, but might want.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Peter.
It's really fascinating stuff. And if you don't mind, I'd like to perhaps discuss a bit more about sort of the hopes and aspirations that studying magical texts can reveal, because I imagine that a lot of these spells were almost kind of driven for certain purposes and to fulfill certain needs or anxieties that people had. So if you don't mind, Professor, could you please expand a bit more about the sort of ideals and hopes that you can learn about when studying these magical texts?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And the problem you start with as a historian is that with the diversity of magic texts over 500 years in the Middle Ages, we have several hundred manuscripts and over 100 texts. Most things are covered. So you have magic for anxieties about illness, sudden death, income, and then political. You have other manuscripts and texts which represent political longing for success, fortune, the favor of princes, and others which represent emotional expressions. There's a lot of magic for love and hatred, for example. So first you have to navigate. You start off and say, well, is there a kind of magic for everyone? And then aren't all these, doesn't it sort of express what everyone always wants, which is protection from harm, the love of a good person, and, you know, treasure, flying horses. So it's a good question, because you actually have to then drill down and start unpacking some of this. And there's some very interesting manuscripts surviving, which we can see are specialized. They have lots of different rituals and experiments. And so there's one for love in the Bibliothèque Nationale in France, which seems to have been made for someone at court. So someone wealthy, because producing manuscripts was expensive, and that was their interest. And they seem to have commissioned a ritual magic specialist to do that. And what we see with wealthy and powerful collectors of magic texts is they actually can be less anxious about the transgressive nature. We see books of necromancy listed, actually both in monastic contexts as well, where there's also a kind of protection from scrutiny, but also at court. So we have love in a court setting. We have a necromantic manuscript in Oxford that has a very strong focus on protecting from spirits. So it looks at first like a manual for conjuring demons, but actually all the focus of all the experiments is on protecting oneself from demons. So one would say that was a kind of particular importance to whoever commissioned that or wrote. And in this case, it looks like someone personally wrote the manuscript. There are a lot of cheap, basic ritual objects, paper amulets that were worn on the body to protect against different types of harm. So you could have, these are sort of multi-purpose objects with lots of different images and sometimes prayers and charms on them as well. And they all fold, they're this set of images, and they all fold up into something pocket sized that you can carry on your person. And you'll have an image protecting against fire, next one protecting against demons, next one protecting against sudden death, because for a Christian, sudden death is terrible. You haven't had time to confess your sins and kind of prepare yourself for the journey into the afterlife. So I think, so one sees different social settings and hopes and aspirations arising in those. And we've talked about the cleric wanting horses and treasure. And then I think we could talk about the things that arise in a particularly Christian society. So the genre of ritual magic called Angelic Magic, which involves fasting, being chaste, and then summoning angels, was popular with students and monks. Students at university, because it claimed to give you knowledge of the entire curriculum just by staring at these quite beautiful images with angels and sometimes figures of swords and serpents and what we call verba ignota, sort of nonsense words in these beautiful diagrams, and you meditate upon them. And if you have been performatively virtuous in the right way, angels are supposed to infuse you with knowledge. But another stage of the same set of rituals, which seems to have been more targeted to monks, enables you to have a vision of God and the companionship of angels. So in other words, and I think obviously the protecting from harm relates to the Christian fear of death, but also the kind of tougher daily environment of the Middle Ages. So one can sort of, and then I mean, it's such an interesting question. When we have the Black Death, this terrible plague in the mid-14th century, which killed probably at least 40% of the population of Europe and devastated communities. In this context, of course, as you would expect, we have a lot of new or old kinds of magic being revived, new kinds of magic being created, all to do with the plague. I mean, protecting you from sudden death, but then specific amulets created for the plague. So in Arabic astral magic, there are talismans to do with all of the zodiac signs, and the one for Scorpio has to do with protecting from poison. And this particular talisman became suddenly more popular in the second half of the 14th century. So there are both personal aspirations and anxieties, and those because you're living in a very tough time. It's a good question. I mean, I could go on, but I'll stop there because obviously one can sort of explore this further and further. And many manuscripts tell an individual story about that individual and their hopes and aspirations. I might mention one more example, if I may. There's a manuscript in the Wellcome Library in London, which has this really, I think, slightly unusual but intriguing mix of the mundane and the fantastical. So in the same manuscript is a talisman to ward off mice. But there are also experiments for invisibility, love, and having a flying horse. And, one has to say, actually, when you have problems in life, probably you have these problems of daily life. And then you might have these imaginative interests. And yeah, anyway, I'll stop there.
It's fascinating because, and touching about the individuals, even if we go to the nobility, so to the kings and nobles, basically the same way that probably people in lower classes will believe and maybe without no one knowing doing some magic here or there just to try to better their lives, and that comes since ancient times. But there was timing, or there was times that we know that nobility went to someone who performed magic instead of, for example, just asking a priest for help,
Yeah.
like in desperate times. So
Yeah.
that helped as well, correct, Professor?
Yeah.
In terms of the higher classes.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there is a true cliche that magic is not an alternative to science and religion in the Middle Ages, but rather what you do when you have a sick child and the priest and the doctor haven't helped you. Your child is still sick. Their situation is getting worse. At that point, you might call in the crazy magician that you don't quite believe in what they do, but you know, the prayers haven't helped, the medicine hasn't worked. You might try that anyway. So I think that same quite sort of simple cliche probably works for the court context. There's been some interesting books coming out recently about magic at court, and what they show that this is a very intense competitive context, and there are competing factions. It's quite a dangerous context actually in which to practice magic, because accusations of magic were a way in which, not in every court at all times, but in particular courts in particular places, and often courts where you have vulnerability at the center of power, because you're it's not, your king usually isn't functioning properly, as with Charles VI in France and his bouts of illness of some sort. So where was I going with this? So at court there is obviously, there is more possible. There are priests and there are clerics and physicians who might be trained in magic. So you have access, and you have the means to pay for expensive astrological talismans. But there are very fraught moments around succession, around the fertility of the queen, around informal centers of power, and who you think has more influence than they should, and do they have that influence because they're consulting a magician. And so before the 15th century and the witchcraft persecutions in the 13th and maybe even more the 14th century, what we see is very is cases at trials at court of people, men and women, accused of magic. And sometimes someone is brought down by the accusation that a woman in their entourage, or a physician or a cleric in their entourage, is the actual magical practitioner. But still, it's a weapon. I mean, I'd say actually at court, the weapon of accusation in a way is the most potent, because actually, you know, everyone is, I mean, magic is something that people really are doing. There are magic texts in circulation. You've probably come across them at university. If you have a large enough library, you may well, even inadvertently, have got magic texts amongst works of the use of natural properties, for example.
And that is quite fascinating as well, because having encountered, obviously, during the beginning of Middle Ages, Europe was being converted to Christianism and so on. Everything there is pagan, or it was not coming from Christianity. It was quite difficult for these people to be, or for the performers to be able to continue to do it. However, it survived all over the centuries, and there is what is quite interesting, because it was forbidden, was still used, and sometimes by people that are literally saying, no, you cannot do that, but they continue to do that. So how did this magic survive and adapt in this world moving forward to Christianity, obviously from early Middle Ages?
Yeah, no, that's another very interesting question. Magic survives by changing, really, and it changes very significantly in the 12th and 13th centuries with the translation movement from Arabic that happens mainly in Spain, also in Sicily, Byzantium, the Middle East. And this is the rediscovery of mainly Greek science and math, philosophy and math, and mathematics, Euclid's geometry, philosophy, I was going to say. Greek, Roman, very significant Arabic philosophy and medicine. And so this is Greek science coming via, because it's been, I'm simplifying hugely, but it's been rejected in the early medieval Europe, but has then come through Arabic. In Spain, we have this period, again, simplifying, in the 12th and 13th centuries, Christian kingdoms and Arabic ruled polities as well. And there's a more or less a state of political balance in which, before the 15th century, in which there's a lot of cultural and intellectual exchanges, including Greek and Arabic science and philosophy. Arabic courts and thinkers tended to be more open to astrology and magic at an intellectual level. So we're talking ritual magic linked to astrology and ideas of astral spirits. And the intellectuals, the European intellectuals translating these texts into Latin, take on, I think, and also come with this attitude of toleration. So the occult sciences, for a brief moment, let's say it's 100 years to the mid-13th century, are viewed as interesting and potentially useful technologies. And the suspicion of them is there right from the beginning as well. But nonetheless, the thinkers of the time in natural philosophy and theology are engaging with them seriously. And this, the most important Arabic magic is astral magic. So this is drawing down the planetary spirits mainly into objects like talismans, with invocations, sometimes with sacrifices, with rituals involving lots of different substances from animals, plants, and herbs. But so I've answered your question in a very convoluted way. To answer it
No, amazing.
more simply, magic becomes a body of knowledge with a set of texts. From being in the early medieval Europe something that was more associated with an invocation, words, an invocation to the devil, let's say, rather than the question. So then, I feel I need to bring in to just speak to paganism, because paganism is something quite different. So, because magic texts have gone from Greek to Arabic into Latin, in the Arabic contexts, Islamic writers and thinkers have the same problems with it that Christian writers and thinkers and practitioners do later. They need it to work within a monotheistic viewpoint. So the worship of spirits is toned down, and the reference to rituals only working because God allows it is brought in. And this Islamic take on magic, or making magic a little bit more safe for those who want to practice it, it makes it easier for Christian authors to accept. See what I mean? In fact, so they're more but at the same time, they're more comfortable in some ways with pagan celestial spirits, which they see as set in the sort of the past, than Islam or Judaism. Yeah, and then we have some parts of Europe which are part of another story because they're still being converted to Christianity. So we have in the Icelandic sagas, we have the wonderful idea of the fetch, of the witch sending her or his spirit into an animal. So pagan ideas remain in some places in interesting ways as well, and get absorbed into Christian culture.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's really fascinating stuff. Certainly, as someone with a background in Islamic history, it's really exciting to see how magic sort of was influenced in this period, and especially how sort of cultures even outside of Europe could have an impact on the way that magic was perceived and viewed. And to that end, the next question I'd like to ask is, was there any sort of time at all when sort of different systems of magic in sort of Europe and sort of regions beyond kind of spoke to each other? Or do we get the impression that they were all just kind of isolated kind of pockets of knowledge that perhaps sort of took on various ideas but didn't really communicate or exchange with each other?
Do you mean between Jewish magic and Jewish, Christian and Islamic magic, or between different regions, Christian regions of Europe? Sorry.
I suppose I mean between yes, I suppose between sort of different faiths. So for example, was there any sort of evidence to suggest that perhaps say Christian and Islamic magic kind of influenced each other and they sort of took ideas from one another, or did they remain sort of fairly separate sort of disciplines, which I suppose sort of borrows sort of similar knowledge from translated texts and things like that?
So this is a great question, and there are different ways of answering it. They had already, when Arabic magic is translated into Latin starting from the 11th century, but really in the 12th and 13th, first half of the 13th century, there have already been interactions between Arabic and Jewish magic. And a complex Arabic magic text like the Picatrix, which was written in the 11th century and then translated into Latin and Castilian in the mid-13th century. This has absorbed ideas from Indian religion and magic, from Persian Indian and magic. It's very, very syncretic. And magic is almost by definition syncretic because from the point of view of the author or the practitioner, what matters is bringing elements together that have the power to transform the world. So there's a tendency to kind of build up spirits, prayers, words, stones, herbs, animal parts, and to draw them from different traditions. But I think, but to put it another way, I work on late medieval Europe, so the sort of the 11th to the 15th century. When we look at the 100 or so, more than 100 magic texts we have by the end of the 15th century, and the several hundred manuscript versions of all of them, we have some texts that were translated from Arabic into Latin, stayed pretty much the same all the way through. We have Arabic magic texts to create talismans where the translator removed the invocations to spirits because they didn't approve of them. So we have censored Arabic magic texts. And then we have Arabic magic texts like the Al-Mandal, which is a jinn conjuring text, where I can't remember how many versions, I think six or eight versions survive. And you can see progressively that the jinns turn into angels. And this seems to me not about censorship, but rather about Christianization, is if you're conjuring a spirit, if you want to conjure a spirit to help you with something, you'll kind of want to conjure a spirit that you're familiar with, that means something to your cosmological worldview, because maybe otherwise you won't really be convinced of its existence. So that's a kind of, and then we have quite different categories. So here's another way of looking at the transformation. Necromancy, which is Christian demon conjuring magic, takes the cosmology of Arabic astral magic, but in Arabic astral magic, the spirits are good or bad depending on their planetary ruler. In necromancy, you can have the same rituals or similar rituals, but the spirits are all evil. Now, in your Christian way of thinking about the cosmos, so you have to add layers and layers of protective rituals. So now you, instead of just summoning the spirit, the celestial spirit, as you do in Arabic astral magic, you draw a circle and you stay safe within the circle, and the spirit gets summoned outside. And then sometimes you sacrifice an animal to the spirit to keep it happy. There are sacrifices in Arabic astral magic as well, but they're not quite the same. And you have these layers of invoking God and the saints to help you command the demons, which you don't need in Arabic astral magic. In Arabic astral magic, you need to get the conditions right for the planet. So you have the herbs, animal parts, plants linked to the planet. And then you often, even though not all the planets are very benevolent, you address them in a kind of formal, reverential way. So maybe what I'm saying is that the cosmology, because the cosmologies as well as the religions are different, there are shifts that you need to make. Well, these are practical texts. Before you might be willing to give them a go, would be one way of putting it.
And then probably touching on Peter's question, Peter basically asked about the going between the interactions of Europe and, for example, Islam. But inside of Europe, can we say there is a magical tradition in different countries, or the magic was perceived as the same in the whole Europe, or there was like huge differences between countries, even the North, for example, with the Vikings and etc.?
Yeah. So this one is interesting. I would say for the most part that what we have is for written texts, we have a Latin culture, intellectual culture, that is across Europe. So, and you could go to, because, for example, university teaching was in Latin. You could be from France, but go to university in Oxford, Germany, go to Paris. So texts actually circulated very quickly. So one of the most famous medieval ritual magic texts, which I've already mentioned, the Osnatorian. This is an angel summoning one to have knowledge, and to have the vision of God. This is the one that could take 3 years to produce, although we have about 50 manuscript copies, and some are very short and some are very long. But we think this originated in North Italy, but then became popular in German monasteries among Parisian students. And then the survival of copies depends, like all historical sources, on the fortuna of inquisitions, of later book burnings, of extraordinary libraries. There was a friar in York, John Ergum in England, who had the most extraordinary library of, we have the catalogue surviving, of ritual magic texts, but someone at some point obviously completely disapproved of it
just
we haven't, all gone just like that. Whereas the monastery I studied, Canterbury, had several monks in the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries who were all into magic, had senior enough positions in the monastery, tolerant enough abbots that the books all survived through to the 16th century. In the 16th century, obviously, we have the dissolution of the monasteries, but John Dee was going round hopefully looking at particular English monasteries, and maybe someone said, well, actually Canterbury, they had this great tradition of doing magic, and he picked up all the monks' books. In fact, we have the surviving catalogue, and he ticked the magic text that he wanted to find. So, I mean, this is what I could write a book on this monastery and its magic, its collection of magic books, because thanks to John Dee in the Renaissance. So all of this makes tracking local traditions of magic quite difficult, because the survival of books has other reasons, because the Ars Notoria spreads very quickly because it was very popular. So I mean, this is quite a new field. I think it really came into its own in the 90s. And I think, and obviously historians have now done work on the regional mythologies of witchcraft. So I think this is something that maybe will emerge with future studies and historians, that we will find particular things in France. I mean, from the 13th century, we have texts in the magic texts in the vernacular as well. But for the most part, as far as I can tell, so there are particular French magic texts and English magic texts and Spanish and Italian and so on. But because these are translations from the Latin, they're also very similar across Europe. So there probably is an interesting regional story to tell, but it's for a future historian.
Just as a question of curiosity, and I don't know even if it is possible, but having a medieval Europe being Christianized, from your studies, there is any part of Europe or any country that you would say there was more tolerate, or they will tolerate more magic than the others, let's say, per se?
Yeah. Yes. Okay. This is a really interesting question, and it can be answered. I think it's different at different times in different places. And now I'm trying to think how to answer. So my instinct is, so I think the two best examples actually probably are heresy and witchcraft. Because the Inquisition or inquisitors working in southern France at the beginning of the 14th century, right to the Pope. These are quite famous, several letters to the Pope, saying we are investigating heresy mainly in this context as groups of people reading text expressing wrong beliefs. So this is mainly the Cathar heresy, but there are other heresies in the area too. But they write to the Pope and say, well, we're finding these other practices. Magic is marginal but disseminated everywhere, and we're not sure whether they are the same, whether they count as heresy, and we're not sure whether we should expand our energies on persecuting them. And the short answer to the question was, when the heretical movements were less dangerous to the church, when this is the late 13th century, when magic texts, learned magic texts, were more widely disseminated, and when you had a paranoid Pope, this is John the 22nd, who was, I mean, he may have been right, but he was quite convinced the whole time that people were having magical plots against him, were trying to poison him with magic and all these things. So you have these three things coming together. And so in the 14th century, France was definitely less tolerant. I mean, so actually to answer your question, it's easier to find the more intolerant places. France was, I would say, at this period more intolerant. And then for various historical reasons, partly also to do with heresy, partly also to do with politics, southern Germany, what is now modern Switzerland, parts of France are where we have the intensification of witchcraft persecutions in the 15th century, and magic gets swept up into that. So was anywhere really tolerant? I mean, before the 13th century, there was 100 years before the 13th century where there was much more openness to the possibilities of magic.
Exactly.
And I would say in general, for magic that drew on natural objects, and to some extent to magic that was to do with rituals to summon angels, these were always more tolerated as well.
It's a little bit more closer to the religion, right?
Yeah. So another answer to your question, I've answered it about intolerance rather than tolerance.
Yeah.
Maybe intolerance is always easier to
yeah, definitely. Peter?
Brilliant. Thank you very much. That was really interesting stuff. So if you don't mind, I'd like to move on the conversation a little bit to the topic of images and use of things like animals, for example, in magical texts. Because I understand from having a look at your research, that also played quite significantly into the way that magic was kind of presented and conceived. So yes, could you please expand a bit more on that and sort of how sort of images and animals and things like that were sort of used in conjunction with magic and magical texts?
Yes. I study images and animals in different contexts, although I'm sure there's interesting ways they come together. Images, I think there are several ways in which images are interesting for studying magic. We're in this interesting period with medieval Europe between various Protestant kinds of iconoclasm and Byzantine iconoclasm. It's a period with relative freedom, an uncritical attitude towards images, and a relative freedom of expression. There is a lot of censorship attached to texts, but I think so that's one thing. Another is that there was clearly a lot of circulation of images as objects, of what we call textual amulets, that were worn on the body. These are the sort of things that don't survive very well, although the few the more complex ones have survived. So finding descriptions of these and looking at the surviving ones is a way of trying to get at the lower social groups that weren't literate and how they thought about and practiced magic. So one of the things that I studied recently in a book on magical figures in the Routledge History of Medieval Magic was I found quite a lot of instructions for these images in books, in manuscripts owned by medical practitioners. So, which led me to suggest that physicians were a group who were offering magical protective objects to some of their patients in the Middle Ages. This was one mode of dissemination of magic. Now, another interesting thing for me about magic and images is that it was one way in which critics targeted magic texts. So they accused, because a lot of Arabic astral magic involved the making of talismans. One line of critique of this kind of magic was that it was idolatrous. It was creating it was claiming to do magic with human-made objects, which wouldn't have been possible unless you had the help of demons, or it involved ritual addressed to an object, which was idolatry. So images were a means of attack. And images, and what I referred to earlier as verba ignota in magic texts, were often used to suggest that they contained languages addressed to demons. So the Ars Notoria, which I keep mentioning, is a good example for the question, what is magic and why were certain magic texts condemned? It has pious goals. Its goals are to have a vision of God, to be saved, to have knowledge. It involves pious practices. The 3 years that you spend doing this text is not the one that I would really suggest anyone do. It's endless saying of prayers, endless meditating upon images, and practices of purification. But it was viewed critically because of the strange images and languages which were thought to link it to demons, and also because it suggested that by performing a ritual, not by you would gain all these extraordinary miraculous things, rather than getting them from the grace of God. So yeah, I mean, a final thought on images might be that because I curated this exhibition at the Ashmolean, medieval objects were harder to find than objects linked to early modern and modern witchcraft, for example. But magic involves rituals, and rituals are often very visual. So we have surviving talismans, we have objects like the mandrake, we have all sorts of images from the Middle Ages with magical words and images inscribed on them, what we call magical characters. So it's really, for me, given the sensory nature of rituals, to have something visual to kind of unpack the ritual with is really helpful and interesting.
We do have some questions from the audience now, and I will pass to Christina.
Okay.
It's two different questions. Christina?
Should I go back to animals later? I'll go back to animals later. It's a very long answer. Yeah.
So Silvio, who is watching us live, asked, does magic in Middle Ages connect with the development of pharmacy in Europe during Middle Ages?
Pharmacy, as in the medical use of. Yeah,
I think so.
Arts.
Yeah.
Yes, it does. But it's a really interesting question. So the history of medicine in this period includes a spectrum of very sophisticated theoretical texts based on knowledge of the human body and substances that affect it and have healing properties in various ways, on the one hand, and traditions of texts describing the properties of herbs and animals and even stones on the other. In other words, there's quite a spectrum between what we would call rational, theoretical, didactic medicine on the one hand, and lists of properties. And the thing about the list of properties, which include properties we would recognize as valid today, curative properties of plants and animal substances, and then magical substances as well. It's difficult to identify magic in a medical context. You can either say that what is magical in a medical context is amulets or talismans, So wearing an animal part on the body is rather than consuming it. Or you can say, or you can look at medical texts and go, well, there's a medical text, but then it's got some recipes in it that are for non-medical uses, like fertility, increasing fertility, for example, or sometimes there's a ritual involving, this is quite common actually, involving how you use the plant. So you have to pick the plant at a certain time of month. You mustn't touch it with iron. You say a prayer to the goddess Earth before you extract it. But there are different ways of telling this story. You could say that these magical uses of animal parts are irrational, traditional bits of native heritage that have just stayed in there almost by accident, and people that aren't in the kind of properly educated university medical texts. But you could also say that some of these texts are working within a Christian worldview in which God created everything in the world to have uses for humans. So there is an idea in medieval encyclopedias that you mention every animal and you mention every part of their body and all the animal substances, and you talk about their uses, because if we experimented more and thought more about animals, we would find all these hidden uses. So yeah, I mean, it's not a great answer to your question, but just to say there's two ways. Yeah, one, so some historians of medicine think that magic is the superstitious bits that are not about the progress of the history of medicine. And some historians would say that descriptions of what to do with animal parts and substances are there because this is a Christian world view about the world, the natural world.
And I do believe there is another question, right, Christina?
Right.
And the one that I just saw that come now, but just do that one first.
So Mehmet said, I am writing from an Islamic country. My question is about the Star of David used for magic in the Middle Ages. As I know, Muslims and Jews use the Star of David for such kinds of magical writings. If related to your area, I would be grateful if you had an answer.
Yes, this is the same as the pentagram, I think, which is an image very common in a kind of magic called Solomonic magic, which is a sort of eclectic mix of Greek, Jewish, and Arabic magic, and involves summoning spirits, angels, and demons, drawing upon the power of God and also the example of Solomon as a wise ruler who also wielded magical powers according to the myths of the myths of the Middle Ages about him being a king who had magical power over demons. But so there is an iconography for magic, but it's an iconography with secular Christian examples as well. So one of the Knights of the Round Table, and I'm going to forget which one it was. I think it was Galahad. It was Galahad or Gawain. Anyway, I've got G in my mind. I don't think it was Percival, but in one of the quests for the Holy Grail, one of the knights that is an example of purity and chivalry has this star on their shield. And here it's not interpreted as a magic symbol, although it is in a secular context, but it's interpreted as a symbol of the knight's piety. So I'd say it wasn't a central symbol in either Christian religion or magic, but is used in both as a symbol of power and purity, and actually of a specific link to Solomon in this case.
Thank you very much. We have another question from George. He said, "Thank you for your wonderful presentation, Professor. Was there a disproportionate interest in both developing and combating magical practices in Catholic Europe as opposed to Orthodox Europe in Middle Ages?"
Yes, so I know less about Byzantine magic than I do about Western European magic. But there are some really good books on it now as well. My recollection of the question that really gets asked in the historiography is a lot of the genres of magic that we can find in Orthodox Europe are very similar. And there is a lot of continuity with the Greek tradition, and particularly of natural magic, so the powers of stones and plants and animals. But the historiographical question is asking why witchcraft didn't have the same impact in Orthodox Europe at all. And one of the answers to this question is probably that there were so many social, economic, and political factors feeding into the origins of witchcraft as well as the reality of magic. But the element in the reality of magic that really must influence the creation of the mythology of witchcraft is demonic magic. And I think that necromancy, the literary genre of necromancy, is probably more of a Western European phenomenon, and that probably fed into witchcraft. What makes the question difficult to answer is that this was the most transgressive kind of magic, and so it was the one that was most destroyed. So we have depending on how you define necromancy, we have under 10 full examples of manuscripts of this genre surviving in Europe, and then shorter texts here and there. But this just makes it harder than any other kind of magic to really say exactly what its geographical origins and circulation was.
Thank you very much.
One more question, right?
Right.
Sorry, suddenly we have a lot of questions coming in.
Yes, we do. I would like to apologize if I am mispronouncing the names. So Christy John said there are dozens of amulets in Old Church Slavonic language and literature. Are they connected to magic or belief in magic, or are they just a part of popular devotion?
Very good question. Yeah. Yes, there are different objects in Western Europe, especially from the 15th century, and the same question applies. And an easy answer would be that often from the perspective of the practitioners, their devotion, and from the perspective of the critic, their magic. One of the things I find interesting about this question is that we find popular amulets and invocations and prayers and blessings and curses, all these elements of the oral tradition of magic. We find them in the 11th century, all the way through to the 15th century. But whether they're likely to be seen as popular devotion or as an illicit magical practice changes a lot. Again, not actually on the region, but on the period. So in the 15th century, for various reasons to do with religious anxieties, political and religious conflicts at the state level, the way that the mythology of witchcraft has taken hold all these popular practices come under scrutiny. And what we see is that because it's very difficult to say whether an amulet or a blessing or a charm is deviant or not, because often these will have Christian images and words on them, right? But they may be used in a way that assumes they will protect without having the kind of willingness of God involved. So what the critics of such practices do is, because they don't know what to do about the objects, so they start turning attention to the practitioners. And this is where gender comes in. So this is where a poorer, less educated person and a woman who was assumed to be weaker mentally and emotionally, and therefore more susceptible to the devil, is more likely to be criticized than let's say, a learned man who's got the same amulet written up into his manuscript. That's an interesting question. And I would say it's probably, I mean, there probably are differences depending on the time and place. And there are some, I mean, an astrological talisman looks quite different from what you might call an amulet, which has only natural objects. So a hare's foot hung around the neck to make someone more fertile, in most cases won't be viewed as problematic. A copper talisman with a symbol of Mars on it might be, but if you can say that you're just wearing it for the metal and not invoking Mars, maybe you'll be okay. And then an image of Christ, which has a medical name on the back, magical name, also might be okay. So it depends a bit on the object and the context.
Thank you very much. We have another question. This time it's from Laura. She asked, does the spread of benevolent magical literary figures like Merlin contribute to magic being tolerated in medieval Europe?
Yes. So, I mean, yes is the short answer, but although it's different with the female practitioners and the male practitioners. So the Arthurian tradition, the Arthurian stories were popular in Britain, but also popular in France, in Sicily. We have German versions, and it's recently been argued in a book by Jean-Baptiste Boudet. So this new historiography on magic and the courts, that rulers had options. So they could, if you were interested in magic and actually wanted to have magic texts in your library, then you would lean towards the idea of Merlin as an elegant, wise counselor. And there were all sorts of practical magic texts that supported this image. So there was the Secret of Secrets, which was a letter supposedly written by Aristotle to Alexander. And some of the versions of this had magical objects and stories in them. So there was a whole literature, but especially the kind of sources mentioned by the questioner to do with Merlin, that sanitized magic, but also made it elegant and romantic and learned. And again, it's a question of confidence. And some rulers were powerful enough, or people at court, to go with this image of the magician and magic as something interesting, because occult knowledge was something that the powerful king would be good for a powerful king to possess. However, courts were full of clerics who were trying, and advisors who wanted their king to be the most Christian king, and some of the most Most critical and angry treatises we have against magic were written at court and for court audiences, because they were worried about the conjunction of magic and power. So Nicolas Resnais in the French court in the 14th century wrote very strong, very clever treatises against magic and astrology. And he attacks astrology on rational grounds, that why would the planets influence the personalities? He attacks magic by saying, not by saying that magicians were in league with devils, not by saying magic was false. It's a very, very clever attack on magic. He says, well, what magicians do is they use real substances like poisons and fumes that affect the mind. So these substances actually did exist in real magical rituals that were in circulation. They target the vulnerable, so they target people who are mentally unwell, adolescents, older people, sick people, and they use all the senses. They use tricks with mirrors, they use darkness and light. They create this performance, and the implication is usually that it's in pursuit of financial gain. So there are these two sets of ideas about the magician that a ruler could choose from, if they were in a position to choose, and they might not be. But yeah, the female, and then to speak just briefly about the female practitioners of magic in medieval literature. One can trace these from the 11th to the 15th century, that they're often quite positive in the 11th and 12th century, and they get increasingly malevolent in the 15th century. So Morgana Le Fay in the 15th century is a deeply unpleasant evil figure. But you have Isolt's mother in, I think, and I'm going to remember this wrong, the 12th century, I think, who creates a love potion for her daughter, because her daughter's going to marry someone that she's never met before, and the mother wants the marriage to be a happy one. She wants her daughter to be happy, and of course, dabbling in magic, as many medieval clerics would tell you, is never works out, even if you've got you're morally in the right place, and it all goes horribly wrong because the wrong people drink the magic potion. But just to say, there's a chronological trajectory of magical practitioners in literature as well that gets darker and darker as we get towards the 15th century.
Thank you, Professor. And not to take all of your time, using as like a last question, if you obviously want to do some final remarks after that, but did the end of Middle Ages, as we call, and with the Enlightenment, with science coming in, with the man being more rational, did that contribute for a decline on magic, or not at all?
Yeah. I think several things happen at the end of the 15th century. Maybe I'll mention three. One is that witchcraft persecutions intensified to a huge extent. We go from hundreds killed in the late Middle Ages to tens of thousands between the 16th and 18th century. So we always have to place science and the Enlightenment in this context. Another is that in Italy, in particular, the humanist currents which make man more powerful, more in control of the world, more at the center of cosmology, these actually help magic, because we now have humanists. There is less critique of learned magic, humanists writing magic texts, exploring ideas. But the third thing is, yes, there is a decline. it's not a decline. It's a decline in rational cosmology, in my opinion. So the cosmologies change. Astrology makes less sense, so astral magic is weakened. And then magic is very bound up with religion as much as science. So if from a personal point of view, you're invested in the ideas of God and angels and demons, then the kinds of magic that engage with ideas about angels and demons rather than the properties in nature might not be affected by cosmological shifts. And so an interest in the rituals of magic carries on until today. It's not drawing on powers in the cosmos in the same way that I would say medieval magical practitioners are. Because for a medieval magical practitioner, the cosmological ideas that they're drawing on are part of the mainstream. That we're surrounded by millions of invisible spirits, that natural objects have been placed there by God for humans, that the earth is in the center and the planets are moving, and as they move, they're influencing the earth. So it does make more sense within the cosmology. This isn't to say that you couldn't be skeptical about magic in the Middle Ages. It's never mainstream religion or science, so it can be critiqued both as unholy and as unscientific. It can be critiqued as unscientific because these are, to some extent, it's better to describe these as rituals rather than scientific investigations, even when they are about natural properties. One thing we did in the exhibition Spellbound at the Ashmolean, however, in order to stop people walking into the exhibition and going, oh, these superstitious practices people in the past did, and we're so progressive and modern now. We started with the idea of magical thinking, which is a term of modern psychology, which refers, this is simplifying somewhat, but anyway, it refers to something that you do or think that, or feel that has no relationship to the normal mainstream laws of cause and effect. So we had several examples in the exhibition. Having a lucky object, performing a ritual that stops you feeling anxious, worrying about tempting fate. So the exhibition, you had to walk under it, make a choice to walk under a ladder or around a ladder. And yeah, I mean, the idea was most of us still think magically. So I don't have a lucky object. I don't mind walking under ladders. I don't have any special rituals. But but one of the ones, I borrowed this from a psychological reading rather than history, is could you stab the photograph of a loved one? I mean, there's nothing, doing that does not have any impact in the real world. It's magical thinking, but it's for psychological, it's very difficult to do.
And maybe we can add probably that obviously if we can reduce these in a simple way, you had like a time or period of time that there was a hype in magic, probably in ancient times. Then you had a sort of turmoil during Middle Ages and with the Inquisition and everything. But if we see nowadays, we still have it, like you said, because there's people who still use charms, there's people who still or even with Allan Kardec with the spiritism, and so suddenly something comes up again. And when people probably thought that it will be dead with science, He didn't. No.
Yeah, but it's not. I mean, but is it helpful? We have a climate crisis. I mean, when I looked into magical thinking, I looked at newspaper headline where it was mentioned, and it's mentioned in conjunction with magical thinking won't solve the climate crisis. Magical thinking won't help Brexit. Magical thinking won't. It's used for a context where people are just going, I'm sure it'll be fine. You know, I have my lucky object. I'm sure extreme weather changes won't matter. I don't know. It's psychologically for an individual, it's supposed to be comforting. But yeah, I don't know.
Peter.
Wonderful. Well, I'm very sorry to say that we're coming to the end of what has been a fascinating discussion. I think I speak for all of us when I say that it's been really interesting to delve into the world of medieval magic. So now to finally ask you, Professor Page, do you have any concluding remarks before we finish?
I haven't thought about this very much. And I didn't get to mention animals, which is what I'm working on at the moment, but I won't. Yeah. Well, okay, a couple of concluding remarks. This is quite a new field in history. It's been great to work in it because I've been working in it probably at least 15 years, but when I started, it was, and it still is, a smallish group of colleagues all over the world, and that's been great. To still have a kind of very manageable number of books to read. But I think because it's a new field, there are still questions to be answered. There are still texts to be read. It's a great opportunity for graduate students. And one of the reasons I chose to specialize it very early on when I was thinking about my PhD was because I was interested in, I was already wanting to be a medieval historian, but I was interested in questions to do with religion and science. And I was interested in how medieval people thought about the natural world and about cosmology, but also why they worried about their soul and what rituals they did. And as a topic, it's a wonderful way to bring those two, in some ways, quite different spheres. They're not always different in the Middle Ages, but, you know, to bring them together and to think about questions that relate to both of them. So it's been called by another historian, not me, a crossroads between religion and science. And I think there are lots of interesting intersections.
It's quite fascinating as well.
Absolutely. It's a terrific field, and I hope that it'll continue to grow and develop as time goes on.
Yeah, me too. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Not at all. Thank you ever so much for coming on to Confabulating, for discussing with us tonight. I think I can say we've all really enjoyed the discussion. And thank you very much to everybody watching as well. I'm afraid that concludes our time. But yes, we hope you'll be able to join us in the next episode. So we'll wrap up here. Thank you very much, everyone, and take care.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.